There was a time when the world had shape but had no witnesses, and that is the hardest time for any story to tell, because there was no one to remember it rightly afterward. The earth had been raised, and the seas had been hollowed, and the mountains had been lifted by the hands of the Valar, and then thrown down again by the discord of Melkor, and the lands lay wide and empty under a sky that knew only the light of stars that were not yet bright. Forests grew in silence so deep that no bird sang in them, for birds had not yet awoken. Rivers ran black under starlight, and cut valleys where no feet had ever walked. In the far north, where the world bent toward the cold that would never leave it, there stood a fortress that was not a fortress as elves or men would later understand building, but a wound in the world that had been made into a dwelling. That place was Utumno, the first great stronghold of Melkor, delved under the Iron Mountains before the count of years had any meaning to any living thing. Its gates were hidden under perpetual night, its halls went down beyond any depth that the dwarves would ever dare. Its pits held fires that were not kindled for warmth, and forges that were not made to craft beauty, and around it the earth was broken and twisted, because Melkor could not make and could only mar, and his marring left scars that would never heal. From Utumno his power spread like winter, and the Valar who dwelt in the light of the two trees in the far west knew that their brother had become their enemy, yet they did not yet move against him, for the children who had been promised were not yet awake, and the world was still being prepared for them. In that long waiting, Melkor sat upon a throne that was not a throne of honor, but a seat of dominion, and he believed a thing that is very dangerous for any power to believe. He believed that he was the eldest thing that walked in Arda after the Valar themselves, that nothing in the world was older than his own thought, that whatever he had not made or corrupted was therefore young and weak and could be mastered. It is a belief that makes a tyrant bold, and it made Melkor bold beyond all measure. And while he believed it, while his orcs were still being bred from shadows, and his wolves were still learning to hunt, and his fortress was still growing deeper stone by stone, there was already something else walking above his roof without his knowledge, something that did not march, and did not crawl, and did not need to hide, because hiding is a thing that fear teaches, and fear had never taught it anything at all. Oldest and fatherless, the elves would later call him, when they found him singing in a wood that was young compared to him. The man in blue and yellow, with boots of yellow and a feather in his hat, with a song always ready on his tongue. Tom Bombadil was there before the river and before the tree, before the hill and before the mountain, before the starlight was gathered and before Utumno was dug, and he had walked since the world was still soft from making. He walked not as a conqueror walks, and not as a wanderer who is lost. He walked as one walks who knows every path, because every path was new when he first trod it, and he walked wherever curiosity took him, for curiosity was his only master. On a day that had no date, because dates had not yet been invented, his curiosity took him north. Part 2. The road that was not a road. Far from the light of the trees there were no roads and no maps and no need of either. Tom Bombadil did not travel as armies travel, with purpose and provision. He went as water goes, following the fall of the land, following the sound that pleased him most, and what pleased him most was always a new song or a new riddle. He had walked the young forests where every tree was a wonder, because no tree had yet died, and he had waded the first rivers where the water ran clear and cold, and had never yet tasted blood or ash. He had spoken to the stones when the stones were still warm from shaping, and they had answered slowly, as stones do. He had sung with the first winds that moved over the empty lands, and taught them how to turn in circles. And then he heard something that he had never heard before, a sound that did not belong to wind or water or stone. It was a grinding, a hammering, a roaring of fire from deep below, a noise that tried to be a song but could not keep a tune, because the singer hated the tune he was trying to steal. It came from the north, from under the Iron Mountains, from a place where the earth shuddered without wind, and where the snow melted, though no sun shone upon it. Any elf or man would have heard that sound and turned away, for even before wisdom there is instinct, and instinct would have said that the sound was danger. Tom heard it and turned toward it, because a song that is sung wrong is to Tom the most interesting riddle of all, and he wanted to hear it more clearly. He walked many leagues without haste, for haste is a thing that those who fear time invent, and time had not yet taught Tom to hurry. He walked over plains where no grass had yet been trodden, over rivers that had no names, over hills that would one day be called by names that have not yet been spoken. As he came nearer to the source of the noise, the land changed. Trees grew twisted, waters ran dark. The snow under his yellow boots became grey with ash that fell from no sky. The air tasted of iron and cold fire. And then the ground fell away, and he stood upon a ridge of black rock and looked down into a valley that was not a valley but a pit. And in the pit there were lights like eyes, and gates like mouths, and smoke that rose without wind. That was Utumno, though Tom did not know that name and would not have cared for it if he had known it. To him it was simply a hill that had been dug wrong, a mountain that had been turned upside down, a house built by one who did not know how to build a house. He looked at it with the same bright curiosity with which he would later look at the Barrow Downs and the old forest and the fields of the Shire, and he saw that the master of that house was singing badly, and that the song was making the earth sick. And because he could not leave a bad song unanswered, he began to go down. No guard saw him. No wolf scented him. No spell woven by Melkor caught him, for all those guards and wolves and spells were made to catch things that were afraid, and Tom was not afraid. Fear is a shadow that power casts ahead of itself to make the weak obey, and Tom cast no shadow that such power could catch. He walked down the broken rock as if he were walking down a country lane, his boots making no print that would last, his voice already humming a tune that did not belong to Utumno at all. Part 3. The Throne Beneath the World. Deep in Utumno, beneath halls larger than any city that would ever be built, beneath bridges of stone that spanned chasms of fire, beneath chambers where dragons were still only a thought in the mind of their maker, Melkor sat and was mighty. He was not yet Morgoth to any but the Valar who would name him so, but he was already that in truth, for he had taken the light that had been given him and turned it inward until it became a hunger. His form was tall and terrible, crowned with ice that did not melt, though fire burned about him, robed in darkness that seemed to drink the dim light of the lamps his slaves had made. His hand held a mace that had broken mountains, and his voice could make the earth shake. Around his throne stood things that would later be counted among the great terrors of the world, Balrogs still bright with corrupted flame, wolves that had learned speech, servants who had been Maiar and had chosen to kneel. He was holding court as a dark lord holds court when there is no one left to dispute his claim, and he was speaking of the future as if the future were already his. He spoke of the children who would awake, and how they would be taken and bent, how the light of the trees would be quenched, how the Valar would be shut out of the north forever, how all that was made would be unmade and remade in his own image. His servants listened and bowed, and the fires burned higher with each promise, for promises of dominion are fuel to those who have sold themselves for dominion. It was in the middle of such a promise that the singing was first heard in Utumno. At first it was so small that the Balrogs thought it was a crack in the stone, a trick of the deep air moving through a new tunnel. Then it was a little louder, and they thought it was a slave who dared to sing at work, and they turned to punish the imagined singer. Then it was clear, and it was not a trick, and it was not a slave, and every head in that throng turned toward the great doors, because the singing was coming from beyond the great doors, from up the long road of darkness that led to the surface, from a place where no singing should have been at all. And the song was not a hymn to Melkor, and not a lament of the enslaved, and not a chant of war. It was a nonsense song, a walking song, a song about a feather and a boot and a river and a hill, and it was being sung by a voice that was merry and entirely unafraid. The doors of Utumno had been made to keep the Valar out, and they were heavy beyond the strength of any army of elves or men, yet they had been left ajar that day because Melkor believed no one would dare to approach them. The voice came through the opening without hurry, drawing nearer with each verse, and the firelight in the hall flickered not because the song commanded it, but because the song did not ask permission of fire or stone, and therefore neither fire nor stone knew how to answer it. Then the singer appeared in the doorway. Part 4. The visitor who was not summoned. He was not tall, he was not armoured. He did not carry a weapon that any eye in that hall would have recognized as a weapon. He wore a blue jacket and yellow boots, and upon his head a hat with a blue feather, and his beard was brown, and his eyes were blue and bright as forget-me-nots, and he was smiling as one smiles who has found a curious thing on a walk and wishes to examine it more closely. He did not bow when he saw the throne. He did not kneel when he saw the crown. He did not fall silent when he saw the balrogs. He looked about the vast and terrible hall as a guest looks about a house that is poorly kept, with mild surprise and a little pity, and then he looked straight at Melkor, who had been called the mightiest of the Ainur, and he tipped his hat. In the chronicles that were written long afterward by the wise of Valinor, in the books that the elves carried across the sea, there is no mention of this meeting, because none of Melkor's servants would ever speak of it, and Melkor himself forbade its memory upon pain of unmaking, and Tom Bombadil never thought it important enough to tell as a tale, for to him it was only one walk among many. Yet in that moment in Utumno, before the first elves had yet breathed, two of the eldest things in Arda looked at one another, and neither looked away. Melkor rose from his throne. When he rose, the hall shook, and the fires roared, and the balrogs stepped back, though they did not wish to be seen stepping back, for the courtesy of fear had been taught to them long before. He looked down at the small figure in the doorway, and for the first time in an age he felt a thing that he had not felt since he stood in the thought of Eru before the music began, and heard a theme that was not his own. He felt that he was being measured, not by strength and not by malice, for those were the only measures he understood, but by something else entirely, a measure that found him loud and out of tune. He spoke, and his voice was like the grinding of mountains when they are torn by earthquake, and he asked the question that power always asks when it meets something it cannot at once crush. He asked who had sent the stranger, and for whom the stranger sang, and why the stranger dared to come unbidden into the house of the master of Arda. Tom answered as Tom always answers, with a song that is not an answer as power understands answering, but is an answer as the world understands answering. He sang the name of the earth and the water, the stone and the tree, the wind and the rain, the hill and the heather, the river daughter and the old forest, all things that had been before Utumno was dug, and would be after Utumno was thrown down. And his song said without pride and without challenge that he had not been sent by anyone, that he sang for himself, because singing is what one does when one is awake, and the world is there to sing to, and that daring is a word that belongs to those who fear refusal, which he did not. Part 5. The Offer of the World Under the Mountain. Melkor listened to that song, and understood it less than he understood the speech of the Valar, yet he understood one thing about it that chilled him more than any council of Manwë ever had. He understood that the song did not break. All other songs broke in Utumno. The hymns of the Valar broke when brought into that place, because Melkor had learned how to twist them into mockery. The laments of captives broke, because despair breaks all laments. Even the chanting of his own servants broke at times, because fear makes any voice shake. But the small, merry song of the man in blue and yellow did not break, and did not shake, and did not change its tune to suit the hall. The hall had to change a little to contain it, and the fires burned a little less red while the song was in the air, and the great shadows drew back a fraction, though no one commanded them. Melkor, who was cunning beyond any cunning that would ever walk in the world, did what cunning always does when it meets something it cannot break. He tried to buy it. He descended one step from his throne, and then another, until he stood before Tom at his full height, a darkness crowned and terrible, and he made an offer. The offer was not in words as men use words, but in visions thrust into the air between them, images made of shadow and fire that any other will would have found hard to resist. He showed a world under the mountain that would never end, halls without number, where no sun need ever shine, where winter would be law and obedience would be peace, where Tom might sit at his right hand and be master of all that is beneath, king under the stone forever, warden of the deep places, keeper of the roots of the world. No need to wander, the vision said. No need to be small and alone in a wood. There is a kingdom here for one who understands stone and root, a power that can hold the earth still so that it never changes and therefore never disappoints. All this could be given, and more, if only the small singer would take the dark hand that was offered and sing henceforth for the master of Utumno, and let his old free song be forgotten. It was a great offer, as such offers are measured, for Melkor had offered dominion to many, and many had taken it, and been honoured after a fashion in his service, given whips and crowns of their own. He offered it now because he did not know what else to do with a thing that would not fear him, and gifts are the last weapon of those who have exhausted terror. Tom listened, and Tom looked, and Tom smiled, not in mockery but in the way one smiles at a child who has offered to trade a whole forest for a single acorn. And then he did the one thing that no one in Utumno had ever done to an offer of Melkor. He refused without anger and without pride, and he sang again. Part 6. The Song That Would Not Be Silence. What Tom sang then was not a battle hymn, and not a spell of protection as the wise of later ages would understand spells. It was the oldest kind of song, the kind that names things truly, and therefore makes them be more truly themselves. He sang about the stone, and the stone remembered that it had been part of a mountain before it was cut for a throne. He sang about fire, and the fire remembered that it had once been light before it was made to burn as a weapon. He sang about the dark, and the dark remembered that it had once been only the absence of light and not a cloak for cruelty. And as he sang, the hall of Utumno, which had been built to be timeless and unchanging, was forced for a few heartbeats to remember that it had once been earth that was young and soft, earth that had been sung into shape by a music that was greater than any will within it. The song did not attack Melkor. It did not need to. Attack is an acknowledgement that the thing attacked has power over the attacker, and Tom had no such acknowledgement to give. The song simply continued to be itself, merry and entire, in a place that had been made to forbid any song but one, and the place could not contain it without cracking a little at the edges. The Balrogs felt the cracking first, though they would never have named it so. Their flame burned less high, their shadows were less vast. The wolves whined without knowing why. The great pillars that held the roof of the world trembled, not because they were struck, but because they were reminded of what it was to be mere stone, and stone in its true nature does not wish to hold up a tyranny forever. Melkor felt it most of all, because he was the will that held all that marring together, and any reminding of the true world was a loosening of his will. He felt the song pass through the thought by which he held Utumno in shape, and he felt that thought fray. Not much, not enough to throw down his fortress, but enough to tell him a truth that he had denied since before the world was made. He had believed that he was the first and oldest will after Eru, that all things were either his or would become his, that whatever he had not made could be broken, and whatever could not be broken could be avoided until it could be broken later. Now before him stood a small thing in a blue coat that had not been made by him, and could not be broken by him, and could not be avoided, because it had walked in uninvited and was not leaving until its curiosity was satisfied. And the most terrible part was not that the thing was stronger. It was not stronger as Melkor measured strength. The most terrible part was that it did not wish to be stronger at all, and therefore strength had no place to take hold of it. For the first time since he had declared himself master of Arda, Melkor heard a song that would not be silenced, and in hearing it, he understood that he was not the eldest. Somewhere in the thought of Eru, before even the Ainur had been called to sing, there had been a mirth and a simplicity that the great discord had not touched, because it had never deigned to notice the discord at all. That mirth had taken shape in the world not as a Valar, and not as a Maya, and not as a child, but as Tom Bombadil, fatherless and oldest, first and only, the one who would be there when the last tree had fallen and the last stone had been broken, still singing. Melkor could not silence that song, because to silence it, he would have had to understand it, and to understand it, he would have had to become it, and to become it, he would have had to cease to be Melkor. Part 7. The First Silence of the Dark Lord. There is a silence that follows when a great voice has tried to speak and has found no answer that obeys. Melkor knew that silence in that hall. He stood before Tom with his dark crown still upon his brow and his mace still in his hand. Yet he did not raise the mace, for he knew with a knowledge deeper than cunning that to strike the small singer would be to strike water with a sword, to command the wind to kneel. The blow would pass through and the song would continue, and the hall would remember a little more of what it had been before it was a prison, and each such remembering would cost him more of his will. So he did not strike. He did not offer again. He did not speak the great curses by which he had bound others, for curses are chains, and Tom had no place where a chain could fasten. He stood and let the song finish as it would, and when the last merry note faded among the pillars of Utumno, the silence that remained was not the silence of dominion, but the silence of one who has spoken and has not been answered as a master is answered. Tom tipped his hat once more, as if thanking a host whose house had been interesting, though not to his taste, and turned and walked back toward the great doors through which he had come, his boots making the same light prints that would not last, his voice already beginning a new verse about the stone and the fern and the cold that would soon be spring. None of the host moved to bar his way. The Balrogs made a lane, though no one ordered it. The wolves lowered their heads, the lesser servants pressed themselves against the walls, for to bar the way of one who is not afraid is to invite a contest that can only reveal that fear was the only bar that ever existed, and fear had just been shown to be not enough. Melkor watched him go. He watched the blue of the coat and the yellow of the boots grow smaller in the great gloom, watched the feather in the hat bob with each unhurried step, listened to the merry nonsense song grow fainter as it climbed the long road toward the surface, where no light of the trees could yet reach, but where the stars, though dim, were still true. When Tom had gone, and the doors stood empty, and the song could no longer be heard, Melkor turned and ascended again to his throne, and those who knew him best saw that his face, which had been terrible with wrath and pride, was now terrible with a new thing that they had never seen upon it before. It was wonder mingled with hate, and underneath both the first small cold seed of fear. Not fear of the Valar, whom he had always hated but had never truly feared, for he had counted them as his kin and therefore as his peers. Not fear of any army or weapon, for Utumno held weapons enough to darken any army. Fear of a thing that could not be counted at all, a thing that had been before him and would be after him, and that had looked upon his crown and seen only a hat that did not suit its wearer. Long afterward, when the Valar came at last in war and broke Utumno and cast Melkor into the void, those who delved into the ruins said that in the deepest hall, beneath the seat of the throne itself, there was a crack in the stone that no hammer had made, a thin fissure where water that had never run before was now seeping, and above it the stone was a little less black than elsewhere, as if light had once rested there for a moment, and the stone had not entirely forgotten. The servants who had stood in that hall never spoke of the visitor, for they had been forbidden, and after a time they convinced themselves that they had dreamed him, as those who serve tyrants must convince themselves that they have dreamed any mercy they have seen, lest the memory make service intolerable. But Melkor did not forget. In the long ages that followed, through the delving of Angband and the stealing of the Silmarils and the long war against elves and men, when his counsellors spoke of Tom Bombadil as a powerless thing of the old forest that need not be reckoned among the great, Melkor would grow silent, and his eye would turn northward, toward the memory of a small song in a great hall, and he would say that the forest thing should be left alone, for it was not worth the attention of the great. Those who heard him thought it was contempt. It was not contempt. It was the one boundary that the first Dark Lord ever set for himself, the one door he left unopened after he had learned that behind it there was a song that would not be silenced. Part 8. Why the world remembers differently. When the elves awoke at last by the water of Cuivienen, under stars that Varda had kindled anew, they awoke to a world that felt very old and very new at once, and they sang their first songs about starlight and water and wonder. They did not sing about Utumno, for they had not yet learned to fear it. They did not sing about Tom Bombadil, for though he came among them sometimes in those early wandering years, he sang his own songs, and did not teach them theirs, and they thought him only a merry spirit of the wood, which he was, though not only that. When Orome found them, and brought word to Valinor, and when the Valar made war upon Melkor, and broke his first fortress, they found many horrors in Utumno, but they did not find the small yellow boots, nor the crack where a song had made the stone remember. For by then the world had moved, and Tom had moved with it, walking always, singing always, being himself. The wise in later ages would puzzle over Tom, and ask what he was, Valar, or Maya, or spirit of the earth, and they would never settle upon an answer, because the question itself belonged to a kind of thinking that Tom never shared. He was, the elves said at last, and that was enough, for to say he is to say that he was, before saying was needed. What Melkor learned in that hall, before the elves awoke, was a thing that no law in Middle-earth has ever set down plainly, though Gandalf guessed at it when he said that far, far below the deepest delving of the dwarves, the world is gnawed by nameless things older than Sauron. He guessed that evil is not the oldest thing in the world, and therefore not the strongest, though it is often the loudest. Beneath all delvings and all dominions, there is a mirth that evil did not make, and cannot unmake, a simplicity that cunning cannot buy, a song that tyranny cannot silence, because it never sought to contend with tyranny at all. Tom Bombadil walked into Utumno because it was there, and he walked out again because there were other places to walk. He did not defeat Morgoth, as the Valar would later defeat him with war and chains, for defeat was not his thought. He did something that to Morgoth was more confounding than defeat. He left him unchanged and unbroken, and therefore without excuse, having shown him plainly that there is a power in Arda that is not power over others, and that such power is beyond any dark lord to touch or take. And Morgoth, who desired to possess all things, learned that there was at least one thing that could not be possessed, not because it was hidden, and not because it was defended, but because it was free. And freedom is the one possession that ceases to exist the moment it is owned. Part 9. The Song That Remains. If you walk in the old forest today, far from Utumno that is now a broken waste, and far from Angband that is now drowned under the sea, you may still hear a voice singing among the trees, a voice that is merry and a little nonsensical, a voice that names the willow and the river and the hill, and makes each thing more truly itself by naming it. That voice is the same voice that once sang in the deepest hall of the first dark. It has not grown older, and it has not grown younger. It has not learned to hate the dark, and it has not learned to love dominion. It sings because the world is there to sing to, and it will sing when the last shadow has passed and the last crown has rusted, because it sang before the first shadow fell, and before the first crown was forged. Morgoth is gone beyond the walls of the world, thrust through the door of night, where he can no longer mar the earth. Yet, if his thought could still reach back to Utumno, he would still hear, if he listened, that small, unbreakable song that once made his fires burn a little less red, and he would remember the day when he offered the world under the mountain to a wanderer in yellow boots and blue feather, and the wanderer answered with a tune that would not break, and the Dark Lord knew for the first time that he was not the eldest and not the master of all. That knowledge did not save him, for he chose not to be saved, but it remained in the world as a secret that the wise could feel though they could not prove. It is why Elrond would later say that Tom should be left to himself, for his power is not as power is reckoned among the great. It is why Gandalf would say that there are things older and deeper than any evil the world knows, and that even the wise cannot see all ends. It is why the elves, when they speak of the evils that remain, add always in a whisper that there are also things that remain unfallen, first and fatherless, that remember the world before the wound. And if you stand very still in a wood where the light falls in shafts and motes of dust turn in the air, and if you listen not for a great hymn, and not for a chant of war, but for a small walking song, about boots and feather and river and hill. You may yet catch the echo of that first meeting, when the Dark Lord heard a song he could not silence, and you may understand why the world, though much marred, has never been wholly unmade. For as long as that song continues, the world is not wholly in the hands of those who would own it, and hope, though it be small and clad in blue and yellow, walks still upon the earth, unafraid.